Bessie Alden had turned down 17 men in 2 territories without once losing sleep over it, and she intended to keep right on doing so until the day they put her in the ground. That was the plain and simple truth of it, known from the dusty corridors of Laramie County all the way down through the rolling grasslands of the Colorado Territory. Men had come to her door with hats in hand and hope in their eyes, ranchers, merchants, a traveling preacher with soft hands and a softer spine, 2 brothers who had the poor sense to ask on the same afternoon, and every single one of them had received the same answer. No. Not a softened no, not a maybe come back later no, but a clear and final no that left no room for negotiation. Bessie Alden was not a woman who left doors ajar that she intended to keep closed. She was 28 years old in the spring of 1878, standing 5 feet and 5 inches tall with dark auburn hair that she pinned up every morning with the same tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her. Her eyes were the color of creek water after a long rain, not quite green, not quite brown, something in between that shifted depending on the light. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from the time a fence post had kicked back and caught her when she was 16, and she had never once thought to be embarrassed of it. It was part of the landscape of her face, same as the faint freckles across her nose that the Wyoming sun kept insisting on bringing out no matter how many times she wore her hat low. She had come to own the Alden place in a manner that nobody in Calverton, Wyoming could quite pretend was ordinary for a woman. Her father, Thomas Alden, had died of fever in the winter of 1874, leaving behind 40 acres of decent grazing land, a 2-room house that needed its roof patched, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a daughter who had been working the land alongside him since she was old enough to lift a feed bucket. There had been no sons. There had been a mother, but Margaret Alden had gone to her rest 3 years before Thomas, taken by the same swift cruelty of the frontier that took so many women who worked too hard for too little. What remained was Bessie, the land, and a very clear understanding that nobody else was going to manage either one for her. The town of Calverton was not large. It sat at the edge of a broad valley where a creek called Miller's Run bent south toward flatter country, and it consisted of a general store run by the Hatch family, a saloon called the Amber Rose that tried to maintain a certain dignity and mostly failed, a livery stable, a church with a bell that cracked in the cold, a post office that doubled as a barber shop, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings that testified to the ambitions of their owners in varying degrees of success. The nearest town of any real size was nearly 40 miles east, and people in Calverton therefore tended to know one another's business with an intimacy that was sometimes comforting and frequently aggravating. Bessie's business was known, discussed, and occasionally debated. The fact that she had managed her property alone for 4 years was impressive to some and deeply unsettling to others. The fact that she continued to refuse every man who expressed an interest in solving the supposed problem of her solitude was a subject of considerable speculation. Some said she was too proud. Others said she was peculiar. Old Clara Hatch at the general store, who had outlived 2 husbands and intended to outlive a third if he kept pushing his luck, said that Bessie Alden was simply a woman who knew her own mind, and that most people had no idea how rare that was. Bessie didn't pay much attention to any of it. She had cattle to tend, 40 acres to manage, and a fence line along the western edge of her property that had been giving her trouble since February. The trouble with the fence was straightforward in diagnosis and stubborn in resolution. The winter had been hard. The ground had heaved in the freeze-in-thaw cycle that late February had pushed through the valley, and 3 posts along the western run had come up out of the earth at angles that rendered the fence line useless. 2 of her neighbor Harlan Pratt's steers had already found the gap and wandered through it, and Harlan, who was not a bad man but was not a particularly helpful one either, had retrieved his cattle with an air of exaggerated patience that Bessie found more irritating than his cattle's trespassing. She had the posts. She had the wire. What she did not have was the particular combination of time and energy that the job required. Because running 40 acres with hired help, you could only sometimes afford, demanded a constant and exhausting allocation of both. She had a hired man named Pete Gruber who came 3 days a week and was worth every penny she paid him, but Pete had gone to visit his daughter in Cheyenne and would not be back until the end of the month. The fence could not wait until the end of the month. Harlan Pratt's patience, such as it was, would not stretch that far. On the 4th morning of May, 1878, Bessie loaded her fence tools into the back of the wagon, hitched her bay mare Clover to the traces, and drove out to the western property line with the intention of doing what needed to be done. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming spring morning that looked like summer from a distance and felt like October the moment you stepped into the shade. The mountains to the northwest still held their snow, white and unhurried against a sky that was just beginning to commit to being blue. She had been working for about an hour, had managed to get one post firmly reseated and tamped down, and was wrestling with the second when she heard horse hooves on the road that ran along the property line. This road, such as it was, connected Calverton to 2 or 3 smaller homesteads further up the valley, and it saw occasional traffic from riders and wagons that had business in that direction. Bessie did not look up immediately. She had learned early that looking up from work every time something moved was a habit that mostly cost you time, but the hooves slowed. Then they stopped. "That post is going to need to go in about 6 inches deeper on the south side," said a voice that she did not recognize, "or the next good wind is going to take it right back out." Bessie did look up then, because she did not appreciate being told about her own fence by someone she had not asked. The man sitting on the sorrel horse at the edge of the road was not anyone she had seen in Calverton before. He was tall in the saddle, which generally meant tall out of it, with broad shoulders under a faded work coat the color of a winter prairie. His hat was brown and well worn, creased the way a hat gets when it belongs to someone who wears it seriously. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two either side of it, with a face that had been out in the weather long enough to earn its lines but had not yet been beaten down by them. His jaw was clean-shaved and square, and he had dark eyes under dark brows that were currently directed at her fence post with what appeared to be genuine professional interest. "I know about my fence post," Bessie said, and her tone made it clear that she did not require further education on the subject. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and something in the way he said it told her that he meant it without any kind of edge attached. He was not mocking her. He was simply agreeing. He made no move to ride on. He also made no move to get down off his horse without being invited, which Bessie noted despite herself. "You passing through?" she asked, because standing here having this conversation was burning daylight. "Was going to," he said. "Name's Orville Walker. I've been working for the Double Creek Ranch up near Laramie. My contract there ended last week. Heard there might be work further west in the valley." Bessie regarded him for a moment. Orville Walker looked back at her fence post like a man who was bothered by a problem he could see the solution to and had not yet been given permission to address. "There are 2 more posts need doing after this one," she said, not entirely sure why she was saying it. "I'm paying a fair day's wage if you know what you're doing with a post-hole digger and a fence stretcher." "I do," he said. He swung down from the sorrel with the easy economy of someone who had been getting on and off horses his entire life, tied the animal to a branch of the cottonwood tree that grew at the corner of the property, rolled up the sleeves of his work coat, picked up the post-hole digger from where it leaned against the wagon wheel, and went to work. He was right about the 6 inches, she noticed. She did not say so. They worked the rest of that morning in a companionable silence that surprised Bessie somewhat, because she was not generally a person who found the company of strangers comfortable. But Orville Walker worked with a steady, unpretentious competence that was its own kind of language. He did not try to take over her tools. He did not make suggestions about how she was managing her end of things. He did the job that needed doing with the same focused attention he had directed at the fence post from the road, and by noon all 3 posts were in the ground, properly seated, and the wire was stretched tight enough to satisfy anyone. They ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of her wagon with the food Bessie had brought: biscuits and cold bacon and a jar of water. And the silence shifted from work silence to a different kind, the kind that asks to be filled. It was Orville who filled it, asking first about the lay of the land in the valley, the water situation, whether Miller's Run ran reliable in the dry months. Questions about the country that a man looking for work would sensibly ask. Bessie answered them directly because she saw no reason not to. He asked nothing personal. He did not ask about her husband or her father or whether she managed the place alone. The absence of those questions was, in its way, as notable as anything he did say. At the end of the day, she paid him what she had promised. He thanked her, shook her hand once with a firm, brief grip, untied the sorrel, and rode west toward the homesteads up the valley. Bessie watched him go for exactly as long as it took her to realize she was watching, and then she turned around and drove her wagon back to the barn. That should have been the end of it, except that the following Tuesday, when she was driving the wagon into Calverton for her weekly supply run at the Hatch store, she saw Orville Walker coming out of the feed barn across the street. He raised a hand in brief acknowledgement. She nodded back. It was perfectly unremarkable. Then Clara Hatch, who had the instincts of a woman who had been reading people for 64 years and expected compensation for the talent, remarked from behind her counter that the new hand over at the Dawes place had come highly recommended out of Laramie County, that his name was Walker, and that he had signed on with Elias Dawes for the spring and summer season. The Dawes place was, as Clara Hatch and Bessie both knew perfectly well, 3 miles up the road from the Alden property. "He seems capable enough," Bessie said, in the tone of a woman who was purchasing flour and had no other particular opinions. Clara Hatch's expression suggested she found this assessment deeply insufficient, but she had the wisdom not to push it. Life in Calverton rolled on through May with the particular rhythm that the frontier established and enforced regardless of individual preference. There were things that needed doing, and they needed doing in the order that the seasons and the land dictated, and the doing of them occupied the days from first light to last in a way that left little room for anything the frontier did not deem essential. Bessie branded the new calves with Pete Gruber's help now that Pete was back from Cheyenne. She repaired the section of barn roof that had been threatening to fail all winter. She planted her kitchen garden in the dark soil behind the house and staked out the bean rows with the particular care of someone who understood that what went into that garden in May was what came out of the root cellar in December. She saw Orville Walker on the road occasionally, as was inevitable given that the same road served both properties. They exchanged the kind of greetings that passing neighbors exchange, brief, civil, carrying no more weight than they needed to. He did not stop. She did not invite him to. This was entirely appropriate, and Bessie had no complaints about it. It was on a Saturday in the middle of May that she stopped in at the Amber Rose to collect payment from Bill Tanner, who had purchased one of her steers at the spring market and had thus far paid in promissory optimism rather than actual money. The Amber Rose was not a place Bessie visited often, but it was not a place she was afraid of either. She had her father's directness and her mother's composure, and between the two of them she generally had what she needed. Bill Tanner was at the bar. He paid up with a minimum of argument after Bessie reminded him, in front of 3 witnesses, of the terms they had agreed upon. She was folding the bills into her pocket and preparing to leave when she became aware of a conversation happening at the table nearest the door that was being conducted at a volume that suggested its participants either did not know she was there or did not care. "Can't last much longer out there on her own," said a voice she recognized as belonging to Floyd Mercer, who operated a cattle operation of middling success and outsized self-regard. A woman needs a proper arrangement. The Alden place is good land, too. Be ashamed to see it go under. She manages well enough, said the man across from him, whose name Bessie did not know. For now, Floyd said. But there's limits to what a woman can do alone. Nature of things. Bessie did not stop walking. She walked through the door of the amber rose and let it fall shut behind her, and she stood for a moment on the wooden boardwalk outside in the Saturday afternoon sun, and she felt the particular flavor of anger that she had been feeling since she was 16 years old and men had started deciding that her situation was a problem they were entitled to solve. She felt it, and then she put it in the place she kept such things, and she walked down the street to where Clover was tied. Orville Walker was leaning against the hitch post 2 horses down, making some adjustment to his saddle. He glanced up when she appeared. Something in her expression apparently told him something, because he did not say anything cheerful or attempt any pleasantry. He simply went back to the buckle he was working on, and the steadiness of it was oddly settling. "Good afternoon," she said. "Afternoon, Miss Alden," he said. She untied Clover and drove home, and she did not think about Orville Walker any further that day. Or so she told herself, which was a different thing from it actually being true. June arrived with a heat that had been negotiating itself upward through the last 2 weeks of May and now committed fully, bringing the dry smell of the high plains grass and the sound of crickets beginning their work in the early evenings. Bessie's garden came up well. The cattle were in good condition. Pete Gruber was reliable. The western fence held without complaint. It was during this time that Franklin Poole came to call. Franklin Poole was a rancher from the southern end of the valley, a widower of 2 years with a prosperous operation and 3 children who needed mothering, and he had apparently decided, upon no particular encouragement, that Bessie Alden was the solution to that need. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon when the polite expectation of the day made turning someone away from your door a slightly more complicated business, and he sat in her front room with his hat on his knee and made what he clearly believed to be a compelling case. He was not a bad man. He was 41 years old and solid in his manner and had built his ranch through genuine work, and Bessie could see that he meant well by every syllable he spoke, none of which made the slightest difference. "Mr. Poole," she said when he had finished, "I am grateful for your regard, and I mean that sincerely, but the answer is no." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared for resistance and found himself none the less unprepared for it. "I hope you'll think on it," he said. "I have thought on it," she said. "The answer is still no. I hope your situation resolves well. I believe you'll find the right person. It isn't me." He left. She watched his horse go down the road from the front window, and she felt nothing in particular except the clean, settled feeling she always felt when she had said what was true. What she had not told Franklin Poole, and had not told any of the men before him, was the specific shape of the no inside her. It was not, as some assumed, a hatred of men or a vow of independence made in some dramatic moment of grief. It was simpler and harder to explain than that. She had watched her mother work herself to the bone in service of a marriage that was not cruel but was not equal, and she had understood from a very young age that a marriage which asked a woman to diminish herself in exchange for security was a bargain she was not willing to make. She was not opposed to love. She was opposed to disappearing, which was what most of the arrangements she had been offered seemed to require. She had never said this to anyone in Calverton. She was not sure she had words for it quite. She had only the feeling and the fence line that she maintained, and the land that was hers, and the choices that remained her own. On the 3rd of June, Elia's Dawes fence line in the north pasture failed dramatically when a section of old post gave way, taking a good 50 feet of wire down with it, and allowing his cattle access to the road. Dawes was in town that day, and his wife was managing things at the house with a toddler on her hip and another expected in the fall, and the situation required immediate handling. Orville Walker handled it. He rode the fence line, identified the damage, borrowed what he needed from the Dawes barn, and spent the better part of a day restoring order. Bessie heard about this from Pete Gruber, who had heard it from the Dawes farmhand in the manner that information traveled in Calverton. "Capable man," Pete said. He was fixing a wagon wheel in the barn, and he said it with the focused delivery of a man dropping a piece of information and seeing where it lands. "Apparently," Bessie said. "Hardworking," Pete added. "Doesn't get into trouble at the saloon, minds his business. He spun the wheel to check its action. Good with fence." "Pete," Bessie said. "Yes, ma'am." "Finish the wheel." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and did not appear in the least bit chastened. The summer moved forward the way summers on the Wyoming high plains move, which is to say, with a relentlessness that demanded everything you had and occasionally more. The days were long and hot, and the work was constant, and Bessie drove herself through them with the methodical determination that had kept the Alden place running for 4 years. She was not unhappy. She had never been prone to unhappiness in the way that required company to cure it. She had her land and her garden and her animals and her books, and in the evenings she sometimes sat on the front step while the light died in the west and felt the specific peace of a day that had asked everything of her and found her sufficient. But something had shifted since May, and she was too honest with herself to pretend she could not locate it. It was small and inconvenient, and she had no intention of giving it any more attention than it deserved. It was simply that when she saw Orville Walker on the road, she noticed the noticing. He rode past on his way to and from the Dawes place. He raised a hand. She returned it. Once, when Clover had thrown a shoe on the road between the two properties and Bessie had been walking the mare back slowly, he had come by going the other direction and stopped without making a production of it, checked the mare's hoof with the same calm competence he brought to everything, confirmed what she already knew, and walked with her back to her property line before tipping his hat and turning back. They had talked about the mare, the road condition, the dry weather. It had taken perhaps 20 minutes. It had been entirely unremarkable. She thought about it 3 times the following morning before she caught herself and made herself stop. There was a church social in mid-June that Calverton organized every year, a genuine occasion in a town where genuine occasions were scarce. Tables were set out in the meadow behind the church. Food was brought by every family that could contribute, and for one afternoon, the various concerns and competitions of a small frontier community were suspended in favor of something that aspired to simple community. Bessie went because she always went, because it would have been a statement not to, and because Clara Hatch made a dried apple cake that was worth attending for on its own terms. She was eating said cake and listening to Ellen Dawes describe the approach of her second child with the vivid specificity of a woman who had been through it before and had no illusions left, when she became aware that Orville Walker was standing at the far edge of the tables talking to Elias Dawes and the minister, Reverend Cole, who had come down from Laramie for the season. He was wearing a clean shirt, which was dark blue and properly ironed, and he had shaved that morning. These were not extraordinary observations. She made them the way you make any observation about a thing you happen to be looking at. What was slightly more notable was that Floyd Mercer chose that moment to approach her from the left side with a plate of food and an expression of a man who had been rehearsing something. "Miss Alden," Floyd said, "I've been meaning to speak with you." Bessie looked at him with the quiet steadiness that had sent 17 men home with their hopes intact and their proposals declined. "Mr. Mercer," she said. What followed was Floyd Mercer's version of a courtship speech, which was more administrative than romantic, and which included a frank assessment of how their combined land holdings would create a property of real regional consequence. Bessie listened to all of it because she was not impolite, and then she said no with the same clarity and finality she always brought to the word. Floyd Mercer flushed red and said something about a woman in her position needing to be practical, and Bessie said that she was practical every day of her life, which was why her answer was no. Floyd walked away with the wounded dignity of a man who genuinely did not understand what had just happened to him. Bessie turned back to her plate and found that her appetite had not suffered in the least. When she looked up, she found that Orville Walker had apparently witnessed this exchange from his position at the far edge of the tables, because his eyes met hers across the space between them. He did not look amused at Floyd's expense. He looked simply attentive, the way he looked when he was watching a fence post to see if it was plumb. Then he turned back to his conversation with Elia's Dawes, and that was that. That evening, walking back to where her wagon was hitched after the social, she found him behind her by some 30 feet, walking toward the same row of hitched horses and wagons. She slowed without quite deciding to. He walked alongside her for the last several yards. "Floyd Mercer owns good land," Orville said, not making a point, just saying a true thing. "He does," Bessie agreed, "but he talks about it like it's already yours if you'd only see sense." Bessie looked at him sideways. "Most of them do," she said. Orville nodded once. "That's a shame," he said, meaning it plainly, and then they had reached the horses and he tipped his hat and untied the sorrel and she untied Clover, and they drove their separate ways in the warm June evening. She told herself, very firmly, that she was not going to think about the tone of his voice when he said "that's a shame," or the fact that it had sounded like something he meant for her rather than at the men who had said the wrong things. She was very firm about this, and she did think about it anyway, and the thinking about it kept her company longer than she would have liked on the drive home. The 4th of July came and Calverton celebrated in the fashion of a small town doing its patriotic best. A flag ceremony in the morning, a midday meal of serious ambition, a rifle competition in the afternoon, and a small gathering of fireworks at dusk that were modest in scale but greatly appreciated. Bessie won the rifle competition, which surprised no one who knew her, and flustered a significant portion of the men who did not. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, and she had maintained the skill with the same methodical discipline she brought to everything else. Orville Walker finished second. He came and shook her hand afterward with a grin that rearranged his face into something she had not seen before, something younger and less careful, and said, "I have never lost to someone who made it look that easy." "You weren't far behind," she said. "Far enough," he said, and the grin did not go anywhere. She found that she was smiling back before she made any decision to do so. That was new. That was something she filed away for examination later, when she was alone and could be honest with herself about what it meant. July moved into August. The heat peaked and held, and the cattle required more water management than usual. Bessie organized a temporary rotation that brought them closer to Miller's Run during the hottest weeks, which was additional work but kept the herd in condition. Pete Gruber was essential during this period, and she told him so, which embarrassed him thoroughly and made him work even harder, which she had somewhat anticipated. It was during the second week of August that she had occasion to go into Calverton on a Wednesday rather than her usual Tuesday, because she had received a letter from her father's cousin in Ohio that needed a reply sent promptly. While she was at the post office, which doubled as a barber shop and which therefore smelled reassuringly of soap, she encountered Orville Walker coming out of the door as she was going in. This was the routine awkwardness of a small town. What was slightly less routine was that the letter she had drafted in response to her father's cousin had been blown by the door's movement, and 2 pages of it were now somewhere at knee height between them, and they both reached for them at the same time. Their hands did not quite touch. They both pulled back with the instinct of people who had been careful about such things, and Orville stood up with the pages and handed them to her with a formality that she found oddly endearing. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. He held the door for her. She went in and mailed the letter, and when she came out he was still on the boardwalk, not waiting exactly. He was looking at something down the street, but he had not moved either. "Miss Alden," he said, "I wonder if I could trouble you for some direction. I'm looking for a man named Garrett who is supposed to have a property near the East Fork of Miller's Run, and I can't find anyone who knows precisely where it sits." Bessie knew the Garrett place. She gave him clear directions. He thanked her. She asked because it was a natural question what his business with Garrett was. He told her that he was looking into a piece of land that Garrett had spoken of selling, a 20-acre parcel adjacent to the Garrett property that he had been holding for his son who had since decided not to come west. "You're thinking of buying land here?" she asked. "I am thinking about it," he said carefully. "I've been working other men's land for 8 years. I'd like a piece of my own." He paused. "I like this valley." Bessie looked at him for a moment. "It's good land," she said. "Good water. Winters are harder than they look in summer." "I've wintered in Montana," he said. "I'll manage Wyoming." "I imagine you will," she said. She drove home. She spent a considerable part of the evening thinking about the fact that Orville Walker was looking to buy land in the valley and had said he liked it here. And she was strict with herself about how much significance she allowed those facts. She was 30 years old almost. She would be 30 in September, and she was not a woman who spent her evenings spinning fantasies out of a man buying land and saying he liked the scenery. She was practical. She was clear-eyed. She had said no to 17 men with complete composure. She was also, she admitted in the dark of her bedroom with the kind of honesty that only comes when there is no audience, slightly afraid. Not afraid of him. She did not think Orville Walker was anything to be afraid of in that way. She was afraid of a different thing, the thing that had lived quietly under all the no's she had said over the years, the suspicion that she was not actually opposed to love but only to its particular costs as she had witnessed and feared them, and that if the right version of it showed up, she would not have nearly as many walls as she had believed. This was an uncomfortable thing to know about yourself. She went to sleep anyway, because the cattle still needed tending in the morning. September arrived, and with it Bessie's 30th birthday, which she marked quietly with a good supper and the particular satisfaction of a decade's worth of becoming the exact person she had intended to be. She was not sad about 30. She was not sad about being unmarried. She was simply who she was, which was enough. The Garrett sale went through in early September. Orville Walker bought the 20-acre parcel for what Bessie heard from Pete, who had heard from Elias Dawes, was a fair price. He was still working for Dawes through the fall season to build his funds, but the land was his, and there was a small cabin on it of the type that the valley's early settlers had put up, rough-hewn and plain but watertight and solid. The plan, apparently, was to run a small cattle operation the following spring, building up from modest beginnings. Bessie heard all of this and felt, with some degree of irritation at herself, something that she could only honestly describe as pleased. It was October that brought the trouble. Not catastrophic trouble, not the kind of thing that broke people, but the kind that reminded you that the frontier was not a romantic notion, but a set of genuine and indifferent conditions. A early cold snap in the first week of October, harder than usual, harder than anyone had anticipated, took down 2 of Bessie's younger cattle and left a third in uncertain condition. The third was a heifer she had named Daisy with the unsentimental naming of a rancher who knows better and does it anyway, and Daisy needed to be kept warm and closely watched through several nights of serious cold. Bessie sat up with her for the first 2 nights. Pete did the third. On the morning of the 4th day, when the cold had broken and Daisy had turned a corner toward recovery, Bessie came out of the barn into the gray October morning, feeling the specific exhaustion of someone who has not slept properly in 4 days. She was standing in the yard letting the cold air wake her up when she heard horse hooves and found Orville Walker coming up her lane. He had a covered pot in his right hand, held carefully against the motion of the horse, and he explained without preamble or ceremony that Ellen Dawes had heard from Pete about the heifer situation and had sent soup, because Ellen Dawes was the kind of woman who responded to difficulty with food, which was a reasonable philosophy. Bessie looked at the soup pot and then at Orville. "Tell Mrs. Dawes thank you," she said. "I will," he said. He handed the pot down to her. He did not make a production of it, and he did not say anything about how she looked, which was wise of him since 4 days without proper sleep had made their mark. He looked past her at the barn. She pulled through. "Seems like it," Bessie said. He nodded. "Good." He looked at her directly for a moment, the dark eyes level and without anything complicated in them, just attention. "You need help with anything else out here this week? I'm a half-hour's ride." "I know," she said. "I'll manage." "I know you will," he said, in exactly the tone he had used at the social when he said that's a shame, not arguing with her, not suggesting she couldn't, simply leaving a door open without insisting she walk through it. He turned the sorrel and rode back down the lane. Bessie took the soup inside and ate 2 bowls of it standing at the stove, and she thought about Orville Walker with the kind of unguarded honesty that severe sleep deprivation sometimes produces. She thought about how he had never once suggested she couldn't manage. She thought about how he had shaken her hand after the rifle competition with genuine respect and that wide, unguarded grin. She thought about the 20 acres he had bought because he liked the valley, and about the way he looked at things: fences, fence posts, troubled heifers. Her with the same steady, serious attention, the kind that said the thing he was looking at mattered. She thought about all of that, and then she went to bed and slept for 10 hours, and when she woke up the thinking was still there waiting for her. November came in on the heels of October's cold snap and established itself firmly, bringing shorter days and the serious work of preparing the property for winter. There was firewood to lay in, the root cellar to organize, the cattle to move to the winter pasture, the barn to check for gaps and weaknesses. It was hard, familiar, necessary work, and Bessie and Pete moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a 2-person operation that had been doing this together for 3 years. On the second Saturday of November, Bessie's western fence gave out again. Not the posts Orville Walker had set in May, those were solid as ever and would be for years. This was a different section, further south, where the wire had rusted through at an old splice and parted under the weight of a dry cottonwood branch that had fallen across it in the October storms. One of her steers had found the gap immediately, because cattle have a philosophical commitment to finding any gap in any fence at any hour, and was calmly grazing on the other side of the line by the time Bessie discovered the damage on Saturday morning. Pete was not due until Monday. Bessie drove the steer back through the gap, retrieved her wire tools from the barn, and drove out to the broken section. It was a gray day with the smell of coming snow in it, not bitter yet but moving in that direction, and the fence lay in a soft, drooping loop where the rusted wire had parted. She had the replacement wire and the stretcher, and she set about the job the way she set about every job, with the intention of doing it properly regardless of the conditions. She heard horse hooves on the road before she had the old wire fully cleared. Orville Walker again. He was not, she thought, appearing from nowhere. This was the road to his property too, and he passed it regularly. He had a perfectly legitimate reason to be on this road at any hour. He stopped. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. He got down off the sorrel and tied him to the cottonwood corner post exactly as he had in May, and he picked up the other end of the replacement wire and held it taut while she worked the stretcher. They worked in the way they had worked on that first morning, with a silence that was full rather than empty. The wind had picked up a little, and it pushed dry grass smell across the open land, and somewhere in the cottonwood a bird was making a decision about winter. Bessie was concentrating on the wire connection, working the clip through with cold fingers, and she said without particularly meaning to say it out loud, "I've been thinking about something." "All right," Orville said, holding the wire tension steady. There was a silence in which she finished the clip and tested the tension and found it good. She stood up straight and looked at the fence and nodded at him. "I've said no to a significant number of men," she said. "I've heard something to that effect," he said, which was honest. "I've said no because what they were offering wasn't what I wanted," she said. "It was always a trade, land for hand, help for company, security for something of me." "Yes," he said. "That's not." She stopped. The bird in the cottonwood finished its decision and flew. That's not what this is. She finally turned to look at him. Is it? Orville Walker looked at her, and whatever careful expression he usually wore had gone somewhere else, and what was underneath it was straightforward and serious and warm in the way that the first genuine spring day is warm, not performative, just actual. No, he said, it isn't. Then what is it? She said. He turned toward her fully, and she saw that his hands, still holding the wire tool he had been using, were not quite steady. That small, involuntary truth did something to the inside of her chest. Bessie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, I have been trying to determine the right way to the right time, or whether there is a right time. He stopped. He looked at her fence and then back at her, and something like a rueful expression crossed his face. I'm fixing your fence and I still can't find the right words. You're fixing it very well, she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended. I'm not a man who's good at speeches, he said. I'm not going to tell you about your land or your situation or what would be practical. I don't think you need any man's assessment of your situation. He met her eyes with that level, serious attention that she had seen directed at everything from fence posts to troubled heifers. I think you're the most capable and clear-thinking person I've met in this territory or any other, and I think you are also somehow the most decent one. And I have been thinking about you since the first morning I stopped on this road, and you told me you already knew about your fence post. The ghost of that grin moved across his mouth. Which you did. I did, she said, and she noticed that she had not yet said no, and that the absence of it was enormous. I'm not asking for your land or your situation or anything that belongs to you, he said. I'm asking, he paused, and it was a real pause, the kind a man makes when he is choosing words the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. I'm asking if you would allow me to come calling, as a man who would very much like to know you better. No other agenda than that. Bessie Alden, who had said no to 17 men in 2 territories without once losing sleep over it, stood by her fence on a gray November morning with the smell of coming snow in the air, and looked at Orville Walker, and found that the word no was not anywhere in her. She searched for it with the diligence of someone who has relied on a tool for years and suddenly finds it gone, and she did not find it. What she found instead was something she had been carrying carefully for months without quite acknowledging its weight. Yes, she said, and that was how it began. He came on Sunday afternoon the next day, because waiting until the following week seemed, by unspoken mutual agreement, unnecessary. He came with his hat in hand and sat in her front room, and they talked for 3 hours about things they had not had occasion to talk about before: his family in Missouri, a father who had been a farmer until the soil gave out, and who had never quite recovered from the disappointment of it, 2 brothers he wrote to, but did not see often, his 8 years of ranch work through 4 territories, why he had wanted land of his own. She told him about her parents, about learning the land from her father, about her mother's hands and what it meant to have watched her mother work, and to have decided at some age she could not now quite pinpoint that she would not live a life that asked her to be less than she was. She did not dress it up. She told it plain. He listened the way he looked at things, completely and without interruption. At the end of the afternoon he said he had better let her get to her evening, and he stood and put his hat on and thanked her for the coffee she had made and the conversation, and at the door he looked at her with that unguarded directness and said, "Same time next Sunday." "Same time," she said. The Sundays became the organizing structure of November and into December, the point toward which the week oriented itself. They talked. They walked the property line when the weather permitted, which it did not always, and when it did not they sat by her fire with the wood stove radiating its steady heat, and the coffee between them and the conversation ranging wherever it chose to go. He was not a man who talked simply to fill space. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say, and when he listened he was genuinely listening, not waiting for his turn. These were not common qualities, in Bessie's experience, and she found herself valuing them more with each Sunday that passed. He was also funny in the understated way of a man who observes things carefully, and has a clear view of their absurdity. He told her about a cattle drive he had been part of in his second year of ranch work, in which the trail boss had been so convinced of his own infallibility that he had led a herd of 200 cattle directly into a box canyon that every other man on the crew had identified as a box canyon, because the trail boss had decided it was a shortcut, and his certainty had outrun his geography. The cattle had been fine. The trail boss's pride had not recovered for a season and a half. Bessie laughed at this with the full, unguarded laugh she did not produce for most people, and Orville watched her laugh with an expression that she did not examine too closely, because looking at it directly was difficult in a way she was still getting used to. In December, 3 days before Christmas, he asked if he could take her to the Christmas gathering at the church. She said yes. They attended together, which was noticed by everyone in Calverton, and commented on by approximately half of them to the other half within 48 hours, as was the custom in a small town where entertainment was limited and new developments were treated accordingly. Clara Hatch looked at them both with the expression of a woman watching something that confirmed a theory she had held for some time. Bessie caught her eye across the room, and Clara Hatch gave her a nod of such specific satisfaction that it almost made Bessie laugh out loud. Floyd Mercer was also at the gathering. He watched Bessie and Orville Walker with an expression she could not quite read from across the room. Not hostile, exactly, more the look of a man reassessing a calculation. He nodded at her when their eyes met, and she nodded back, and that was the extent of it. Orville did not make any kind of display. He stood beside her when they talked to people, not in front of her or behind her, and he did not speak for her or answer questions that were directed to her, and she noticed this the way you notice when air is clean rather than heavy, with simple gratitude. Walking out to the wagon after the gathering, in the cold blue December night with the first real snow of the season beginning to fall in slow, unhurried flakes, he reached for her hand. It was not dramatic. It was a simple reaching, the way you reach for something that is yours but that you are not taking. You are asking with the gesture itself. She gave him her hand. They stood for a moment in the churchyard with the snow coming down and the windows of the church throwing warm yellow light across the white ground, and she felt something settle inside her the way the land settles after a long thaw, deep and solid and irreversible. "Merry Christmas, Bessie," he said. "Merry Christmas, Orville," she said. He drove her home in the snow, and they sat on the front step of her house for a time despite the cold, because neither of them wanted the evening to end yet, and they talked about small things, the snow, the coming new year, what spring would look like on his 20 acres when he started building the herd. At some point his arm was around her shoulders, which had happened by the same quiet inevitability as the hand-holding, without announcement, as a natural consequence of two people who had been growing toward each other for months finally arriving in the same place. She leaned against his shoulder and watched the snow fall, and felt the word yes reverberating in her chest like a bell that had been waiting a long time to ring. Christmas came and went. January brought the full Wyoming winter down on the valley with serious intent, and everyone in Calverton and the surrounding homesteads turned their energy to the particular challenge of surviving January in the high plains, which was not a dramatic challenge but was a constant and demanding one. There was wood and water and feed and warmth to maintain, and the days were short and the cold was thorough, and the work did not stop. Orville came on Sundays still, riding the sorrel through whatever the weather produced with the matter-of-fact determination of a man who has made a decision about something. When the snow was too heavy for riding, he did not come, and on those Sundays Bessie found the absence of him specific and measurable in a way she had not anticipated, a small subtraction from the day that made everything slightly less than it would have been. This was new, and she examined it with the careful honesty she brought to everything, and she concluded that she was quite thoroughly in love with Orville Walker, and that this was both the most expected thing that had ever happened to her. Because, in retrospect, every Sunday since November had been heading here with complete directional clarity, and also the most surprising, because she had not known that it could feel like this. Like addition rather than subtraction, like more rather than less. She had not told him this. She was working up to it in the careful, deliberate way she worked up to anything she intended to say clearly and mean completely. He came on the last Sunday of January with the cold sitting at perhaps 5 degrees and the sky the white gray of deep winter, and they sat by the fire and drank coffee, and at some point in the middle of the afternoon she said, "I have been thinking about what I am." He looked at her over his coffee cup with the expression that meant he was listening completely. "I have been afraid for a long time," she said, "not of the ranch or the work or being alone. I have been afraid that love was a kind of disappearing, that to love someone was to become less of yourself." She looked at the fire. "I did not know that it could be something else." "Bessie," he said quietly, "you have never once suggested that I need fixing or managing," she said. "You have never acted as if my land or my situation was a problem you were eligible to solve. You looked at me from the first day as if I was exactly the right amount of person." She turned to look at him. "I have never experienced that before. I don't think I understood what it would feel like." He had set his coffee down. His face was doing something complex and unguarded, and she held his gaze and let it. "What does it feel like?" he said. "Like yes," she said. "Like the first real yes I have ever said in my life." He came around the fire and sat beside her, and she did not move away, and he took both her hands in both of his hands with the same careful, asking quality as everything he did, never assuming, always offering. And she looked at him in the firelight of her front room on a cold January Sunday with the Wyoming winter pressing against the windows, and felt the fear open and close like a fist that had finally let go. "I love you," she said. "I need you to know that." "I love you," he said, and the words came out plain and serious and warm, exactly how she would have expected them from him, and also completely unexpected. "I have for months. I didn't know the right way to say it." "You fix fences," she said, and her voice came out unsteady in a way she recognized as something she was not going to be embarrassed about. "I do," he said, and the grin was there, the wide, unguarded one, and she put her hand to his jaw and felt him steady and warm beneath her palm, and they kissed for the first time in the firelight with the winter outside and the whole of the valley around them, and it was nothing like disappearing. It was nothing like anything she had feared. It was like the fence wire pulled taut and sound and right, holding against whatever the weather brought, doing exactly the thing it was supposed to do. February moved through the valley and into March, and Calverton watched with the undisguised interest of a small community that has been tracking a development and is now witnessing its conclusions. Bessie and Orville were seen together at the general store, at church, on the road between their properties. They were not a spectacle, neither of them was given to spectacle, but they were visible, and the visibility told a clear enough story. Clara Hatch confirmed that she had known since May. This was possibly true. It was definitely what Clara Hatch chose to believe, and since she had done nothing to interfere and had been nothing but kind to both of them, Bessie was happy to let her have the satisfaction of it. Floyd Mercer had, apparently, genuinely reckoned with the situation and arrived at something like peace with it. He had begun paying court to a widow named Mrs. Paulson in the southern end of the valley, and his attentions in that direction seemed to be received with more warmth than Bessie had ever offered him. She wished him well with complete sincerity. Franklin Poole, who had asked her in June of the previous year, had also found some resolution in that direction. His sister had come from Kansas City with her daughter, and the daughter, who was 23 and capable and had no objection to 3 children and a cattle ranch, seemed to be making Franklin genuinely happy. Bessie was glad of it. These resolutions mattered to her not because she felt guilt about the no's she had given. She did not. They had been right, but because she had never wanted anyone to be unhappy on her account. She had only wanted the right to be herself, and it turned out that the right answer, when it came, had not required anyone else to suffer for it. In March, Orville began building on his 20-acre parcel in earnest, spending his days off from the Dawes place working on the structures that would be needed for the coming spring's cattle. Pete Gruber went over on 2 Saturdays to help, which Pete said was because he had nothing better to do, and which Bessie suspected had rather more to do with Pete Gruber's loyal heart than his schedule. Elias Dawes lent his 2 farmhands for a day when the main barn frame needed raising, because that was the kind of thing communities did, the good kind. Bessie went over on the day of the barn raising with food for everyone, because that too was the kind of thing communities did. She stood in the new-turned yard of Orville's 20 acres and watched the frame go up against the March sky, and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes from seeing someone you love moving toward the thing they wanted, building it with their own hands in their own ground. Afterward, when the others had eaten and departed, and the light was going long and golden in the west the way March light does in the valley, she and Orville stood by the half-built barn and looked at his land. "Next spring," he said, "I'll have a small herd started, a dozen cattle to begin, maybe 20 by fall. Miller's Run is good water," she said. "Your east pasture is better than it looks in winter." "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking." "About what?" she said. "About whether there is a world in which 2 operations make sense as one," he said. "Not in the way of taking anything from either of us, but in the way of—" He stopped and looked at her, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his most unguarded, the one that meant he was saying something that mattered to him completely. "In the way of 2 people who love each other and have good land adjacent, and are in the specific position of not having to choose between the land and the person." "What are you saying, Orville?" she said, not because she did not understand but because she wanted to hear him say it. "I'm saying I would like to marry you," he said. "If you will have me. Not as a merger of properties, though I don't mind if that's part of it, but because I want to be in this valley with you for the rest of my life, and I want you to know that is a fixed and permanent intention." He looked at her steadily, the dark eyes serious and sure. "I know you have been asked before, and I know what you said. I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking you to add something if you want it, me." Bessie Alden looked at Orville Walker in the golden March evening on his 20 acres of Wyoming land with the half-built barn behind him and the mountains in the north, still holding their snow and Miller's Run audible somewhere in the quiet. And she felt the fullness of the moment the way she felt the fullness of a day's work well done, complete, sufficient, exactly right. "Yes," she said. He reached for her and she went to him without reservation, and he held her in the March evening with the warmth of a man who has learned that the things he loves are worth holding carefully. And she put her arms around him and held on in return with everything she was. They were married in the Calverton Church on the 14th of April, 1879, by Reverend Cole, who had returned for the spring season and performed the ceremony with evident pleasure. The church was full because Calverton was small and this was news, but also because Bessie Alden had lived in this valley for nearly all of her life, and the people who knew her were, most of them, genuinely glad for her. Clara Hatch cried, which she did not acknowledge and which no one mentioned. Pete Gruber stood in the front row with his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man witnessing the right outcome of a situation he had quietly been advocating for since June of the previous year. Bessie wore her mother's tortoiseshell combs in her hair and a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She did not wear white, because she had no white dress and no particular feeling that white was required. The blue suited her. Orville told her so with an honesty that had no flattery in it, just truth, and she believed him because he did not say things he did not mean. The reception was held in the church meadow, as the social gatherings always were, and there was food and music from a fiddle player named Rodriguez who came up from the Laramie settlements and played with an exuberance that made dancing inevitable. Bessie, who had not danced since she was 17, found that dancing with Orville Walker was not the complicated or diminishing thing she had once imagined it to be. It was simply moving with someone you trusted, which turned out to be easy. They settled into the joined life of the two properties, with the practical intelligence that two capable people bring to a shared project when they have thought carefully about it in advance. The Alden house, being the larger and more established of the two, became the primary home. Orville's 20 acres were managed as a separate operation with its own herd, adjacent and complementary. Pete Gruber continued 3 days a week at the Alden property, and a young man named Jack Torres, who was 20 years old and had come west from New Mexico the previous fall looking for work, was hired on at Orville's property with the intention of taking on more responsibility as the operation grew. Jack was capable and quick to learn and had a way with cattle that Pete Gruber, who was not easily impressed, said was something you could not teach. The spring of 1879 was a good one. The rains came in reasonable proportion, and the grass on the valley floor grew thick and green, and both herds did well in the new growth season. Bessie expanded her kitchen garden to the full length of the south-facing wall of the house, and what came out of that garden over the summer was a testament to what good soil and consistent work produce. Orville built a proper root cellar adjacent to the house over the summer months, larger than the one Bessie had been using, because their combined production required the space, and because he had looked at the existing one in April and said, with typical plainness, that it was going to be inadequate by October. He was right. He often was, about practical things. It was one of the things she had always respected about him and continued to, even now that she knew the full range of what he was, including the fact that he read when he had a free hour, whatever came to hand: newspapers, catalogs, the Bible, 2 novels she had on the shelf from her father's collection, including the fact that he had a short temper about waste and injustice and none at all about things that mattered less, including the fact that he talked to the sorrel horse in a low, conversational tone that she had caught him at twice, and which he showed no embarrassment about. She told him she had caught him. He said the horse had opinions and they were worth considering. She laughed, and he grinned, and they stood in the barn in the summer evening with the hay smell around them, and the particular ease of two people who are completely at home with each other. The summer moved into fall with its harvest and preparation, and fall moved into winter with its demands, and the rhythm of the joined life established itself as all genuine rhythms do, through repetition and small adjustments, until it is simply the way things are. Bessie found that sharing the life did not diminish it. She found instead that it multiplied. The work was still hers to do. She was still the person who made the decisions about the Alden property. She was still fully and completely herself, and alongside all of that was Orville, present and equal and genuinely glad to be there. She had not known it could be this way. She was glad she had waited until she found the version that was. In the spring of 1880, they found out that the family was going to grow. Bessie told Orville on a Tuesday morning in early April while he was eating his breakfast, because she had never been someone who made a ceremony out of the truth. He set his fork down and looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she loved best in his face, the one with nothing held back, and he said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and he stood up and came around the table and held her face in both his hands the way you hold something that matters most, and looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him taking the information in and rearranging himself around it, the way a person does with news that changes the shape of the future. "A boy or a girl, do you think?" he said. "I have no idea," she said. "I've never done this before." "Neither have I," he said. "We'll figure it out." "We will," she said. Calverton received the news with the warmth that a small community extends to its own. Clara Hatch gave Bessie 3 yards of soft flannel without charging for it, saying that she had been putting it aside for the right occasion for some years, and this was clearly it. Pete Gruber became visibly and touchingly careful about every piece of work he asked Bessie to do, constantly assessing whether something was appropriate for her condition, which she generally found unnecessary since she felt entirely well and intended to keep working, and which she also found, in its own way, quite dear. Jack Torres made a cradle. He did not announce this intention. One afternoon in June it simply appeared in the barn, made from good pine wood and sanded smooth, with a curved rocker that was carefully proportioned, and a small carved design of running horses along the head panel. He showed it to her with the self-conscious manner of a young man not sure if he had overstepped, and Bessie looked at the craftsmanship and felt a warmth that brought her unexpectedly close to tears, which she managed with the fortitude she maintained about most things. "It's beautiful, Jack," she said. He turned red to the ears and said it was nothing much, which it was not, and went back to his work. Orville carried the cradle to the house that evening and set it in the corner of the bedroom with the care of someone installing something important, and they stood looking at it for a while in the way that people look at the concrete evidence of the future becoming real. "You'll be a good father," Bessie said. She said it because she believed it, because she had watched him for 2 years now with Pete's grandchildren when Pete brought them by, with Ellen Dawes' 2 children, with Jack Torres when Jack needed guidance on something and received it without condescension or impatience. She believed it the way she believed in good fence posts and reliable water because the evidence supported it completely. He took her hand and held it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I want to be the kind of father who asks what his children think." "You will be," she said. Their son was born on the 17th of September, 1880, a fact that struck Bessie as somewhat organized of the universe given that September was her own birth month. The labor was long and taxing, attended by the midwife from Calverton, a competent and unflappable woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had brought more than 30 children into the valley and approached each one with the same professional gravity. Orville was outside the room for most of it, which was the custom, and Pete Gruber was apparently with him at some point because Pete told her later that Orville had been very quiet and very still, and very clearly performing a kind of internal endurance test that would have been recognizable to any man who had ever waited outside that door. The boy was born healthy and demanding, with a remarkable quantity of dark hair and the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere they were not entirely planning to be and intends to address this. Bessie held him in the first minutes of the world and looked at his furious, searching face and felt a love so immediate and total that it reorganized something fundamental in her, the way a major earthquake reorganizes a landscape, settling everything into new and permanent positions. Orville came in when he was allowed. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the deliberate trust of giving someone the most important thing, and she watched him receive the child with those careful, capable hands, and the expression that crossed his face was not something she could describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. It was simply the face of a man arriving at the center of his life. They named him Thomas Orville Walker, Thomas for her father, Orville because what else would you name a son of Orville Walker but Orville? Thomas was a decided personality from the beginning. He cried with conviction when he had something to say, and was satisfied when the thing was addressed, and he observed the world around him from his earliest weeks with the wide, serious attention of both his parents in concentrated form. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 13 in a way that was clear enough that Pete Gruber said to Bessie, with some private satisfaction, that the boy had opinions already, and that was a quality that ran in the family. The years that followed were full in the way that the best lives are full, not full of dramatic events, but full of the texture and substance of a real life being fully lived. There was work and seasons and weather. There was laughter at the supper table when Orville described something that had happened in the day with his particular understated humor. There was the garden and the herd and the good rhythm of a property well run. There were hard times, because the frontier did not exempt anyone from hard times. A drought in the summer of 1882 that required careful management and some genuine hardship. a season of sickness in the winter of 1883 that moved through the valley and touched most families, and which the Walkers came through without lasting damage, though not without worry. And there were the small moments that accumulate into a life. The morning Orville fixed the gate that had been sticking for 3 weeks, and then stood back and swung it once, smoothly, with the expression of a man who has resolved something that was bothering him. The afternoon Bessie looked out from the garden and saw him teaching Thomas to ride the sorrel horse, leading the animal in slow circles, while Thomas sat very straight and very serious in the saddle with his father's hat falling over his eyes. The evenings by the fire in winter when she read and he read and the house made its small sounds around them, and Thomas slept in the next room, and the world was as ordered and good as a world could be. They had a daughter in the spring of 1883, born in April when the valley was coming back to life, and the meadows were showing green under the last of the snow. They named her Margaret, for Bessie's mother, and she was from the first weeks a different creature than her brother, lighter, quicker to smile, with Bessie's creekwater eyes and Orville's dark hair. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had been the center of the world for his entire lived experience, regarded his sister for the first several weeks with the philosophical reserve of someone deciding what to make of a new development. He arrived at a position of protective authority that would characterize their relationship for as long as Bessie knew them. The Calverton that Bessie and Orville inhabited in these years was a changing place, as all of the West was changing. The territories were filling, new families arriving, the sense of a permanent and settled community asserting itself where 10 years before it had been a collection of bold and tentative experiments. The railroad had come to Laramie, and things that had required a 4-day journey now required an afternoon, and this compression of distance changed the texture of life in ways both practical and less easily named. Some of what arrived with the changing times was not good. There were new pressures on the land, disputes about grazing rights as the open range began its long argument with the fenced range, tensions over water that had not existed when there was enough for everyone. These were the injustices and struggles that played out across the entire West in these years. The small operators pressed by the large cattle interests that were consolidating across Wyoming. The complexity of a land whose original peoples had been displaced by the very settlement that was now organizing itself into towns and counties and systems of law that had not asked them first. Bessie, who had grown up on this land and loved it without illusion, understood these things, and she and Orville talked about them in the evenings with the serious attention they brought to things that mattered. They managed their own operation with the steady integrity that had always characterized the Alden place. They paid their help fairly, which in Calverton in 1884 was not universal. They did not press against their neighbors' boundaries or involve themselves in the water disputes with the tactics that some of the larger operations employed. Jack Torres, who had become an indispensable member of the Walker operation, and had by 1884 been given a profit share arrangement that reflected his contribution, brought his own perspective on what the changing West looked like to a man who had come north from New Mexico and had his own understanding of the land's contested history. They listened to him. They tried to be the kind of people worth working for. The Dawes family sold their property in 1884 and moved to California, a departure that was felt in the community as these departures always were, the loss of known neighbors leaving a gap that new ones would eventually fill, but not immediately. Orville had worked for Elias Dawes in the year of his arrival and thought well of him, and the goodbye was a real one. Ellen Dawes embraced Bessie with the warmth of 4 years of neighborliness, and said she hoped the valley treated them well for another 40, which Bessie intended it to. The new family on the Dawes place was the Brennan family, husband and wife and 3 children, and a grandmother who sat on the porch in the summer heat with the imperturbable composure of someone who had seen everything already. They were good neighbors, the Brennans. They were exactly what a good neighbor is, which is present when needed and private when not, and they took care of their land. Clara Hatch died in the winter of 1885, which was a loss that Calverton felt in the particular way communities feel the loss of someone who has known them continuously and honestly for a long time. She had lived to 69 and had managed her third husband with the same competent authority she had managed everything else, and he had outlived her, which she would have found amusing if she could have known it. Bessie stood at her funeral in the cold February day and thought about what Clara Hatch had said about women knowing their own minds and how rare it was, and thought that Clara Hatch had known her own mind in full measure and that the valley was smaller for her absence. Thomas Walker, at 5 years old, understood that something sad had happened and asked Bessie that evening why Mrs. Hatch was not going to be at the store anymore. Bessie told him that Mrs. Hatch had died, which meant her body had stopped working and she had gone somewhere else, and Thomas considered this with the grave attention of a 5-year-old encountering mortality for the first time. He asked if it hurt. Bessie said she did not think it had, which was honest enough since Clara had gone quietly in her sleep. Thomas said that was good, and then he asked if they could have pie for supper, which was also honest, and Bessie said yes. The spring of 1886 brought news from the east that the cattle markets had changed dramatically, a consequence of overproduction across the range and winter losses across the northern territories. This mattered to every cattle operation in Wyoming, and the Walker-Alden properties were not exempt from the difficulty. The market for beef dropped sharply. The price they received for their fall herd was significantly below what it had been, and the margin that separated comfortable from difficult narrowed. Orville sat at the kitchen table with the account ledgers and the figures and the expression he wore when he was looking at a problem that needed solving, and Bessie sat across from him and they looked at the same figures and worked through the same problem together, because that was what they were. They made adjustments. They reduced the herd size strategically and shifted more of the acreage toward the kind of mixed operation, some cattle, some crops, that gave you multiple sources of income rather than a single one. They kept Jack Torres, who was essential, and managed without additional help in the short term. They spent carefully. The 2-season adjustment was genuinely hard, but it was the kind of hard that the land required and that capable people managed. And by 1888, the situation had stabilized, and the modest prosperity of the early years had returned and settled into something solid. These years of difficulty had the particular effect of cementing what was already solid between them. There had been a version of those hard seasons that might have introduced friction, the accumulated stress of tight money and hard decisions, and two people living in close quarters under sustained pressure. But the Walker household did not work that way. They argued occasionally, because they were both people with strong views and neither of them was constitutionally inclined to silence when they disagreed, and the arguments were real and were also resolved, usually by the next morning, with the completeness of two people who trusted each other even in conflict. The trust was the foundation, and they never lost it, not in the hard years, not in the better years that came after. Margaret Walker, at 6 years old during the hardest of those seasons, absorbed the atmosphere of care and work without being burdened by it. She knew that things were careful. She did not know that it was frightening, because it was not presented to her as frightening. Thomas at 8 was more aware, with the particular sensitivity of a child who has been paying close attention to adults for most of his remembered life, and Orville talked to him plainly on one occasion, sitting on the fence rail in the evening, telling him that they were managing well and that managing was what you did when things got hard. Thomas listened and nodded and said, "Like when the heifer got sick." And Orville said exactly like that, and Thomas said okay. By 1889, when Wyoming achieved statehood, the valley had settled into its mature form, the raw edges of the frontier smoothed somewhat by time and community, and the ordinary accumulation of people learning to live alongside each other. Calverton was not a large town, would never be a large town, but it was a real one, with a school now and a proper doctor and a two-story hotel of modest ambition. It had the quality of a place that intended to endure. The Walker Place, and it was called the Walker Place now, both parcels together, though Bessie's name was still on the Alden deed, and she intended to keep it there, had the same quality. It had been built and tended and managed for too many years to be anything other than permanent, set into the valley floor alongside Miller's Run with its root cellar and its barn and its kitchen garden and its fences that held. Thomas was 9 and Margaret was 6 when Wyoming achieved statehood, and Bessie took them both into Calverton for the celebration, a genuine occasion with a flag ceremony and speeches, and the particular excitement of a community marking a transition it had worked toward for years. Orville stood beside her on the main street of Calverton while the speeches were given, his hand at the small of her back in the easy way of someone who has been beside this person for 10 years and can stand there without thought, naturally and without ceremony, because this is simply where he stands. She looked at him sideways in the October morning of Wyoming statehood and felt the particular quality of a love that has been through time. Not the urgent newness of that first November day by the fence, not the bright and terrifying openness of that January afternoon by the fire when she had said "I love you" for the first time, but something deeper and more durable than both of those. Built from 10 years of shared mornings and difficult seasons and laughter at the supper table and arguments resolved, and small moments accumulated into the substance of a life. He looked down at her and read whatever was in her expression with the accuracy he had always had about her, and he raised an eyebrow in the way that meant he was asking without words, and she shook her head slightly in the way that meant not anything, just this, just you, just all of it. He squeezed her hand where it rested inside the crook of his arm. The speech from the stage concluded. The crowd cheered. Wyoming was a state. The morning was blue and cold and perfect. They drove home in the afternoon, with Thomas asking questions about what statehood meant in the practical sense, and Margaret asleep against Bessie's side, with the thoroughness of a 6-year-old who has had enough occasion. The valley lay around them in the October light, long and golden and familiar, the mountains north with their permanent snow, Miller's Run somewhere to the south, the Alden 40 on the left and Orville's 20 acres on the right, joined now by more than a deed and a marriage certificate, joined by a decade of living in the same direction with the same values and the same steady, deliberate love. Pete says Jack is thinking of buying his own land, Orville said. He was speaking of Pete Gruber and Jack Torres, which was its own small statement about the passage of time, that Jack had grown from a 20-year-old newcomer to a man of 30 who had been with the Walker operation for 10 years and had saved and planned and was now in a position to do what Orville had done in 1878. Which land? Bessie asked. The north parcel behind the Brennan place, Orville said. 30 acres, good water access. He'd do well there, Bessie said. He knows cattle. He does, Orville said. He's a good man. He is, she said. They drove on in the comfortable silence of two people who have said all the most important things many times, and have also said them not at all, having long since moved past the need to narrate them, carrying them instead in the simple, specific way they moved through the world and called it home. That evening, after the children were settled and the animals attended to, and the house quiet, they sat on the front step of the house the way they sometimes did in the good weather months, though October required a blanket and Bessie had one around her shoulders. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind of stars you only get at altitude, thick and unhurried across a sky that has no competition from human light. "I want to ask you something," Orville said. Bessie looked at him with the composed attention she brought to everything. "All right," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. The question was simple and direct, which was his way, and it was the kind of question that a man asks when he is genuinely asking rather than seeking a particular answer. He was looking at her with the dark eyes that had not changed in 12 years, serious and steady and waiting. Bessie looked at her land in the night, the barn dark and solid, the fence line running away into the darkness, Miller's Run somewhere in the quiet making its small sound, the mountains north with their snow invisible now but permanent, the stars above all of it putting everything in its proper scale. She thought about Thomas Alden, her father, who had taught her this land. She thought about Margaret Alden, her mother, who had taught her the cost of a life not fully lived. She thought about 17 men and 2 territories, and a word she had used for years with complete confidence and complete accuracy. She thought about a man on a sorrel horse who had stopped on the road and told her about her fence post without condescension and then gotten down and fixed it because it needed doing, and who had never once in 12 years of knowing her suggested that she was anything less than exactly the right amount of person. She thought about the yes she had said that November morning, and how it had been the truest and most accurate word she had ever spoken. Yes, she said, completely. He took her hand under the blanket and held it with the same careful strength with which he held everything he valued, which was to say completely and without reservation. She leaned against his shoulder the way she had on the front step of this same house 12 years ago in the December snow, and the gesture was the same and also entirely different, changed by 12 years of weight and meaning into something she had no adequate language for, which was all right. The feeling did not require language. It was simply true. The stars moved in their slow Wyoming arc. The cattle settled in the dark barn. Thomas made some small sound in his sleep in the room behind them. Margaret had her father's ability to sleep with total commitment and made no sound at all. The Walker place sat in the valley as it had sat for 12 years, as it would sit for many years more, solid and tended and full of the particular life that 2 people build when they build it as equals, each one fully themselves, each one made more rather than less by the presence of the other. Bessie Alden Walker, who had said no to 17 men in 2 territories without once losing sleep over it, sat on her front step in the Wyoming night with her husband's hand warm in hers, and felt nothing at all like someone who had said no for years and finally said yes. She felt like someone who had known the right answer all along and had simply been waiting for the right question. The question had come while he was fixing her fence, in the wind and cold of a gray November morning, and she had forgotten to say no, and she would be grateful for that forgetting for the rest of her long, full, unhurried, entirely her own life.